I'd like to begin our interview with President Garvey by quoting something he said about the Catholic University, but really applies to all of us as we're coming together as church to heal. The intellectual life, like the acquisition of virtue, is a communal, not a solitary undertaking. We learn from each other. The intellectual culture we create is the product of our collective effort. A Catholic intellectual culture will be something both distinctive and wonderful if we bring the right people into the conversation, and if we work really hard at it. I'm just wondering, as we start talking a little bit about your story, what are today's reflections that you have right now on where this church is at with the abuse scandals among us?
You know, I think it's a wonderful thing that you've suggested. I was obviously thinking of a university when I was talking about the acquisition of virtue being a collective effort, but that's what the church is, isn't it? The church is all of us, and the promise of salvation is something that God makes to the church, not to us as individuals, but as members of the church. So I think that the church has responded to this crisis. It's made huge progress in making our individual churches, our local churches, safe for kids. And when there are cases of sex abuse, they're reported immediately and the issue is addressed properly. That said, the church took a long time to get where it is today. A lot of lives have been damaged and a lot of trust has been broken. So for that reason, it continues to be with us today. You know, we're still talking about issues of historical cases of abuse and today facing issues of accountability of bishops. So there's a lot to do and a lot of healing that needs to happen, but it's something that we're doing together, as you say.
It's also interesting because my experience of being at the university as your guest a number of times, and at some of the gatherings from the Catholic project, which has been developed at the university and launched at the university to address this topic, while it's still a university and seeking collectively virtue, which is an individual exercise, it inevitably is discussing all of this. And the social work school, the schools of law and canonical law, there's not a person who's not really talking and digging deep into their own experiences to explore this. I mean, and with that, I would like to, in the context of somebody who represents that dynamic of dialogue, I'd like to just focus on you a little bit and start with a story. I'll be asking all of our guests just to think back about the gift of your faith originally in your life. You know, where did it come from? Some people will talk about a conversion, some will talk about family. What's the root of your faith? Where was the seed?
That's an easy one for me. It wasn't so much a conversion as just the climate I was born into. It was part of my family from the very beginning. My mother and father prayed with us every morning, every night, took us to mass every day, and we lived next door to my grandparents. My father's parents had 6 children, and they went to mass every day, half an hour before mother and dad. So it was just a natural part of what I grew up with. There was never a time when I questioned it. I would have to say there were times when I lived it better than others, and I went through the usual kind of maturing process that young people do, which involved a fair amount of immaturity. But it's not something that I ever, you know, it's like my being, I don't know, one of 8 children or Irish or uncoordinated. It's just part of who I am.
And it sounds seamless, much like in a way our church is a seamless family to the point where you almost can't imagine it. It's just part of our identity. A lot of survivors talk about coming back to our identity when we were able to reconcile with the church, which is really now the second image. I'm taking 3 snapshots here. The second image is think back to when you first heard, if you can remember, just about an incident of abuse by priest. It might have been classic timeline is in the 80s when we started to see the first national news media covering a suit out of Louisiana. But it could have been any time. A lot of dioceses would have that one case people heard about. When did you first hear and what did you think when you first heard of the first case?
I had two different kinds of firsts. I'm sure that there was that I was aware of those early cases in Louisiana, as others were. But I was living in Boston. I was the dean of the Boston College Law School for 11 years, from '99 until 2010, and so I was right smack in the, in the Hiroshima of the sex abuse crisis there, and paid a lot of attention to it because because I was involved in the church in Boston, and that was my diocese. That was one kind of first, and it had an enormous impact on me because I was dealing with side effects of it, various legal effects, and trying to come to grips with what I could offer as a lawyer or how I could help the
18. It's like suddenly, beyond the grand jury report that I think it was Josh Shapiro released in Pennsylvania, then Cardinal McCarrick, the story began to unravel. What was that like for you to see all of that at that time?
It was a different sort of thing from what Boston had been. When this occurred in Boston, when the Globe stories started to come out and the Archdiocese was dealing with it, the story then was about the offending priests, Gagan and Shanley and those guys, and the reaction of lifelong Catholics who still love the church was, man, this is really horrible, but we'll get through this, and we can be better. Let's put protections in place. Let's make sure this doesn't happen again, and so on. When the Pennsylvania grand jury report came out and the McCarrick thing, and they were really alike in the following respect, they were about bishops, not about the offending priests. And the offense was the management of the crisis rather than the acts of offense, the offensive acts themselves. What do you do when you see one of these cases? And so the bishops had a much harder time addressing that aspect of the crisis because their own credibility, their own management was being called into question. And so they couldn't say, we got this, because people would say, okay, well, who's going to vouch for you that you have it? So there was at that point a place for the laity to say, there's a famous, I used to be a law professor and I taught constitutional law, and there's a famous essay by Charles Black about the practice of judicial review. Judicial review is the practice of the courts reviewing laws passed by Congress or the states to see whether they're constitutional or not. And usually the talk is about how can you justify an undemocratic institution telling a democratically elected group that what they've done is unconstitutional? Where do the courts get that power to do it? And this essay of Charles Black says, the really important thing about judicial review is not when they strike laws down, it's the ability to hold laws up. The fact that they pass muster is itself a reinforcement of the validity of what they've done. Well, so what the bishops needed in this case from the laity was not the laity pointing out who the offending bishops were. What they needed even more importantly was the laity saying, no, this guy's all right. He's really working hard to solve the problem, because that's where most bishops were.
Yeah. Is that where the idea of the Catholic Project came for you?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Was how can we help? And lay people have some, especially after Vatican II and Lumen Gentium, obvious important roles in the church, evangelical roles, not just management roles. But so there are obvious things that Catholics can do, but also things like saying our bishop is doing a really good job, and we're here to tell you that sort of thing couldn't come from anyone else. It couldn't come from the bishops because it was their credibility that was challenged.
And it also was an invitation for collaboration to witness what was continuing. I think people underestimate. First, there are multiple generations of bishops. There were the McCarrick generation that was really under a microscope, but there were bishops who had only been a bishop for a year. Weren't even priests at the time that this was going on.
Right.
And so in terms of having power over decisions, so they did, those people needed the lay people too.
Yeah.
Because they needed to stand with people who would tell them the truth, but also support them. Yeah.
They do support them in that way to others, and also support them in their work of being pastors. You know, they need to be reminded that what you're doing, I mean, solving the abuse crisis, or your slice of it, is a really important thing. But the number one thing you've got to do is to get your flock to heaven. That's,
yeah. I remember you said that to our restorative justice program, where that was some of your comments, that just remember the basics, or that we remind people, especially survivors and family members who are in pain, and wonder, you know, how could this happen? And one of the most important things survivors from Spirit Fire will say is, Jesus is the victor. And it's always important to just remember the basics, because they're strong.
Yeah, it was really great testimony for us to hear coming from you.
Yeah. The beauty of Catholic U too is, with the scholarship and expertise there, even your Bush School of Business was set up. I forget the line about it, but it's about pulling together a really strong business education with the idea of Catholic social teaching. So there's a devotion across the board to a lived Catholic faith. How did the scandals of 2018 affect you as the leader of people who are all committed to that?
Well, it was a reminder that we all have a place in dealing with this. You know, when people talk about Catholic universities, they sometimes think, well, you must have really good theology, you must have really good philosophy, or, you know, in our case, the only school in America of canon law. But it was a reminder that everything that we do here has a role to play. You mentioned the Bush School, and that's a perfect example. You know, think about the crisis in 2018, the attacks on the bishops for their management of the sexual abuse crisis. One way of describing that is, it's a big HR problem. You know, if you've got a really good HR manual and you follow it, and you get somebody who's done something wrong, you know what to do with them. You know, you don't move them to another parish where you can do the same thing all over again, or you don't hide it from the police if it's a criminal offense. You like open your books and say, let's not have any more of this, and here's how we're going to. But that's the sort of thing that business schools teach, not just bishops, but, you know, people who run candy stores, and people who run the Boy Scouts, and people who run high schools. Same with the School of Social Work. You know, the School of Social Work has had an immense role to play in dealing with this, and we've created, for example, an entire suite of courses that provide certificates in child protection, or protecting children and other vulnerable populations, and it involves teaching about social work and law and canon law and business practices, as well as theology. So this has been an issue for the entire university, not just our ecclesiastical schools.
Not to mention how the students welcomed us and even developed a gallery of survivors and their resilience. It's been a really amazing experience. I do think what's going to the idea of scholarship and understanding law, even within Catholic U, you know, I am a survivor. I understand that thanks to the media, this has never been permitted to be buried since the 80s. And thanks to law, this has been brought to what people think of as justice. And I see that, and I'm not here to question that, and I know that you aren't. But I think because we approach it from a legal lens, many people are still expecting justice to come from law. They're expecting the moral right to come from law. It's kind of like what I was reading about with your business classes, but there's also a morality behind business that you're even, I mean, it's kind of surprising, but you even tell students, like, you might not make as much money as people, but you'll contribute to the world. And I'm like, there's actually students these days that do that. But anyway, the idea being that we make a moral decision and we pursue justice, and that law can kind of, in my experiences, I noticed survivors aren't completely healed by pursuing justice through the courts. And I know that we've talked about this a little bit here and there, but I'm still grappling with how to even approach it as a discussion, except that it's just not enough. It's not what is it we're looking at to the law for, especially in now your dual role. I mean, in understanding what survivors suffer, and we're looking for justice. I, of course, come to Jesus, but I'm not going to try to pretend my answer's the right for everyone. You know, what is it as a lawyer? What do people come to the law for that's correct, that's right, And what is it? Where else do we have to go to find the justice that we're looking for?
That's a really good, I love the question, and I love your way of phrasing it, because let me give an analogy about this. Part of the reason we had so many of these cases is that in the period 60s, 70s, 80s, when we had the high point of these abuse issues, bishops, most bishops tried to do the right thing. They struggled with understanding what the right thing was, but it's not as though bishops would just like hide and pretend like it didn't happen. They would send these guys off for treatment at St. Luke's or wherever, and the psychologists then would, they'd be away 6 months, and the psychologists say, "Okay, he's good, you can put him back," and they took this advice, which turned out to be wrong, as psychologists so often are. It wasn't enough to refer them to a psychologist for repair. Often you needed something else. In the first instance, as I've said to many bishops, this was a criminal offense. And if it were my kid and the guy didn't go to jail, I'd go after him with a baseball bat. So the legal system doesn't cure the psychological problems of the priest, but it does something to give restorative justice to the victim. But it doesn't, may solve the dad's problem, but it doesn't make the victim whole. There's another role, not just for psychiatry, but for, here's another example. A number of priests, a number of bishops made the mistake of thinking, well, this is a problem that we can cure not with psychiatry or not with law, but with confession.
Yeah.
And of course, that's the first place you should be going, isn't it? But confessing your sins doesn't solve your problems. These are also psychological problems and criminal problems and so on. So there's so many places where we need to go, so many different aspects to this problem, legal and canon legal and psychological and religious, and we need all of those. We're complicated people made up of lots of different parts, and no one of these parts is gonna fix the whole thing for us. But you mentioned religious repair.
Yeah.
For this, we're doing a project. We at Catholic University, along with Harvard University, are doing a project this spring about the role of religion in restoring people's personal integrity after abuse crises like this. So, yeah, there's a lot of parts.
A lot to explore.
And law is not all of it.
Well, and also law, I know law does deal with evil. I mean, it does, in theory, take evil off. Let's, for example, takes evil off the street, ideally. Or redress after evil, something. But evil's bigger than all of the things that you've mentioned.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where I think all of us struggle, and where our faith is the only thing that knows how to address that. And then through our practice of law or business or whatever we do, we're so much better off because we aren't stymied by. I mean, I will admit this is not an advertisement for Catholic U. I've just done a lot of work with them, and I'm a cynic, but then again, I'm a survivor. So what can I tell you? That's optimistic for a survivor. And the in my experience with the social workers at Catholic U have blown me away, because very, very trauma informed people, which is not as common as people wish, but then also the idea of the faith dimension, which is quite rare.
Mm-hmm.
It's not to say spirituality doesn't have a role, but a real concept of the faith, and so that there's not a recoiling of evil. It's not all pathology. And to me, I mean, that's what kept me sane. So I guess that's the thing I get hopeful about. And I really think this Harvard Catholic U program sounds fantastic, because I know they're going to have some really wonderful things, and they're looking at all faiths, because it's when it's drawing close to God.
Yeah, it's one of the things that I love about our School of Social Work, that they don't take the psychological or social pieces and treat them as distinct or different from the faith. Yeah. Doing both of those things together is much better for their clients and patients.
You know, it brings me to this idea of leadership, which is really the role you're playing in all of this, with people exploring these ideas within their expertise and their calling. You know, leadership and discipleship should be the same. Leaders who follow Christ, I hope, are better leaders. But sometimes discipleship pits somebody against their leadership role. Sometimes maybe those bishops needed to choose, and maybe couldn't know how. At least it's a discussion that happens in a lot of Christian groups where I come and I show up and we start talking. What do you think about leadership and your own discipleship? How does that, you know, are they always in sync? Are they sometimes in tension?
Something that I'm conscious of by virtue of my own job description is something that I'm continually trying to grow into. You know, being the president of the Catholic University of America was in the first instance a little bit intimidating for me, because my predecessors have tended to be priests and then bishops, and so the person who was the president or the rector is the person who leads the community in prayer and says masses and so on. And I don't, that's not my job. I'm not chosen for that. And yet it does call on me as the president of the Catholic University of America to be kind of out there about my own belief and how I live it. It's also very intimidating, you know, when you're conscious of your own shortcomings, to think, yeah, I don't want to be a hypocrite, but I maybe shouldn't go outdoors if I don't want to do that. But trying to be true to your own, both true and extroverted about my own faith has been a good thing for me. You know, it's kind of forced me into an uncomfortable position of doing things that I should have been doing all along and just didn't have the courage to do, but I have to now, because people will call me out on it.
Well, also, I think that there's a tendency toward living in an interior life in Catholicism, probably linked to monastic backgrounds or whatever. And I think that that's quite beautiful, but I think when we come up against evil among us, sometimes it becomes part of the thing we have to overcome. And I'm not telling it was you. I'm just saying, as Catholics, I share that. I tend to be very private about my faith, and it's quite powerful to find myself in front of large groups talking about it.
Yeah, it isn't just my faith, you know. I mean, I'm not by nature an extrovert, so I even just walking around campus, you know, for the first year or so, I'd have to force myself to say hello to everybody I walk past, because if I didn't, they'd say, "What a jerk," you know. I mean, you'd say hi to me, but it's been good for me.
That's really
working for them.
So we're winding down a little bit now, but one of the ways I would like to come toward a close is to ask you a couple comparisons. One is the comparison, and given the topics and your wonderful sharing of your family's experience, you know, you can decline, but now that compared to, let's say, when you first heard about victims and you first had an impression of victims in, let's say, Boston, and now today in 2021, your impression of victims, how does it compare when you first heard about us and then now?
I'd have to say there's been almost a sea change in my own thinking about this. When I first became attentive to the problem when it arose in Boston, my focus was on, okay, so how can we fix the church? What does the church need now? What does it need to do to be better? What does it need to do against people who have been looking for an excuse to whack the church and now have one? And so how can we protect the church and make it better? And my focus now is on what do we need to do for the victims of this? These are the people who have really suffered from this. So I think Colonel Supich has been good. The Holy Father has been good about emphasizing this particular aspect. Let's start with who the victims are and let's see what we can do for them. So my focus is there when it was here.
I appreciate that. I also just want to go back and use a yellow highlighter and say to people who are viewers to remember that there were people even back when it was it was all about litigious more than anything, or at least the press was seeing it, and victims still weren't being paid attention to. There were still people trying to fix the church and reform it who thought that that really was the way to be right with survivors if pressed. It might not have acknowledged it that way, but to do the just thing was that. And now it's people understanding the pastoral thing and I would say not just the victims, but the victims' families are brought home to the table, or at least welcomed home to the table. They don't have to come home, but they know that the welcome is there. And there are people who are able to talk to them without hurting. Then the pastoral piece comes into play. And that's when we're getting really back to something quite beautiful and what I feel. And it's also what I feel among our friends, including you. So I really,
thank you.
I really appreciate that. I would say as we come toward the conclusion, I'll ask you if you have some messages. And one would be, what would be your message toward leaders in higher education who are looking at this and wondering how to play a role that would be positive?
I think education is in a position to provide a really positive role. I mentioned obvious ones like the sorts of courses and certificate programs and educational undertakings that we're offering here, research projects that we're engaged in with the Catholic Project. So the stuff of higher education for a Catholic university is just entwined with all of this. But I think that here too, as we were saying earlier with the bishops, the first thing that we have to convince our students of is why they're members of the church in the first place. I mean, this is all about the church's worst black eye in the century that we're living in the last century. And so that's all true, and we have to recognize that. But if all we know about the church is that it's got this horrible black eye, who wants to belong to an organization like that? Let's start by telling our students, teaching our students why they want to be Catholic.
And I will add that one of the surprising and most valued roles that I've played, the more I've put my experience to service, and so have survivors, the other survivors working with Spirit Fire, has been pretty amazing, because we came back to the faith and can testify to why you do come back to the faith, even if you were at the epicenter of the evil done. And that is something I'd ask our viewers to keep in mind. There's just, it's actually where the redress and the justice and where everything else falls short, it's what makes up for all of it. And
yeah, yours was the most compelling testimony because it shows from your own life what you put ahead of this horrible evil.
And it's worth it. It's worth what it takes a lot, but it's worth it. So as we wind down, I can't say thank you enough. I'm reminded of how Aquinas talks about love taking over where knowledge leaves off. And I always think of things like that when I'm talking with you and with people from Catholic U, because there's no distinction there. There's really an effort to bring love and knowledge, to bring heart and mind together, which is something that happens in therapy for people who are trying to integrate and become whole. So I thank you. Is there anything you'd like to add or to say in closing our lovely chat today?
Well, thank you for inviting me, and thank you for all the good work that you do. It's really been an inspiration to me and everybody who's been working on this project together with you.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much, President Garvey. And I really it's a pleasure talking to you.
Thanks, Teresa. Happy New Year to you.
Well, thank you. I'm going to turn off our recording. Hang on a second.